Welcome to this slideshow highlighting the new, even easier to use Clearly Perfect angles. If you hate drawing lines or ripping away paper when making 45-degree angles, you will love the CPA. You can find this popular notion at your local quilt shop, in catalogs, and on my website, newleafstitches.com. This presentation will introduce you to the new additions to the CPA and to encourage you to do more with your Clearly Perfect angles. Please see my other videos that cover specific information such as positioning on your machine bed, trimming options, and basic techniques for making half-square triangles. This widely used and practical notion has recently been revised with helpful additions I've gleaned during the many classes that I have taught. I hope you will enjoy learning how you can do even more with your Clearly Perfect angles. The new cover page is bright and bold with more pictures and pertinent information. I will point out the changes on the cling shortly. The back side of the insert sheet comes with clearly illustrated instructions that are useful if you need a quick reminder. These instructions are also available on my website as a PDF document. I am pleased to share with you some of the exciting reviews the Clearly Perfect Angles has recently received. American Patchwork and Quilting magazine showcased it in their 20th anniversary edition as one of the 20 items every sewing room should have. Quiltmaker and Quilters newsletter chose the CPA as an inspiration and staff pick, while Nancy Zeman included it in her book, Nancy's Favorite 101 Notions. It also was voted into the top 10 notions in the Golden Quilters Awards. Now, let's start looking at what's new. To begin with, I've indicated right on the product where the needle should pierce the cling, and also a printed reminder that the material needs to be trimmed away for the feed dogs. The dotted 5/8" seam guides have been made bolder as the two facing arrows indicate. An additional horizontal line indicated by the bold arrow has been added a 1/4 inch from the needle position. I will explain in a bit how this comes in handy. What I'm most excited to share with you is the addition of the fabric alignment key. This key is a practical reminder to help you line up your fabric properly. There are two basic techniques, but with these two techniques you can do so much. As you can see, I've circled the simplest technique, sewing from point to point. The key tells us to use the letter A. You will notice that your fabric edges will be on the bottom of the green angled bands on each side, and the point of your fabric will be on the center line. This slide shows how your fabric will be placed to stitch from point to point. Remember, once your fabric is aligned, simply begin stitching and keep the bottom point following up the center line. Don't watch your needle as you are sewing, watch the bottom point. After you have stitched from point to point, trim the seam to a 1/4 inch. When using the technique where you create two half-square triangles by stitching a 1/4 inch on each side of the point, you will look for the letter B. The Clearly Perfect Angles is still color-coded for easy alignment, so your fabric will now be lined up on the top edge of the angled gray band on the left side. For all techniques, the right side of your fabric will always be on the bottom of the green band. Your point will now be on the outside edge of the gray vertical band, all indicated with the letter B. This slide shows how your fabric will look when it is aligned properly. As a reminder, there are 1/4 inch seam guides on each side of the needle, so it's easy to see here that your seam line will be a 1/4 inch from the point. Also remember, if you are on the outside edge of the angled gray band, your point will be on the outside edge of the vertical gray band. Stitch by following the point up this outside edge. Rotate your fabric and stitch a second seam. You can now cut a part between the stitched lines and you have created two half-square triangles. The angled green bands are not used very often, but there may be two circumstances where you will need them. One is when you are working with large squares of fabric. The other would be if you have a sewing setup where you have a shallow sewing surface and lose some of the CPA on the front edge. In either of these cases, your fabric is too large that you don't have a line for your point to follow. Remember I told you there were two techniques? These same two techniques can be used with the angled green bands. If I want to sew from point to point, I would use the fabric key and line the edges up with A. I would then begin to stitch slowly, keeping my fabric at the same angle by watching how they pass through the angled green bands. As you can see in the picture on the right, the fabric moves through the bands exactly the same on both sides. Eventually, there will be a line for your point to follow, and you can go back to watching that. The exact same holds true for the second technique, sewing a 1/4 inch from the points. Begin by lining up the fabric using the B markings. Now, however, when you are stitching and keeping the angle correct, you will notice that the fabric travels through the bands differently. This is okay. The main thing is to keep the angle until you can see the outside of the gray band that your point follows. Now, let's talk about a way that easily saves you time in fabric. Many of us have bags of trim corners thinking we will eventually do something with the extra fabric. Here's a super simple technique. After sewing from point to point, do not trim your seam allowance. Simply move your fabric over so the points are now on the dotted 5/8 inch seam guide. Stitch following the fabric point up the dotted line. You will have two seams, one right across the middle and the second 5/8 inches away. Now trim them apart. The larger half-square triangle is what your pattern called for, and what would have been wasted is now a half-square triangle waiting to be trimmed and put into another project. This is the premise of my book by Martingale, Twice as Nice, Quilts with Scrap-Saving Bonus Projects. Not only are you making the bonus pieces, but there is a pattern provided for their use. Now, here's a little something that is a great reason for leaving the CPA in place all the time, joining your binding strips. Simply extend your fabric strips past each other as is indicated by the black arrows. By doing this, you create inverted points. Because we want to sew straight across, line those inverted points up with the center line and the letter A. There is no need to draw a line and no excuse just to guess for these short seams. Once it is trimmed, you can see how perfectly the strips have been joined. Earlier I mentioned I would give an example of using the new horizontal line that is a 1/4 inch from the needle position. When joining your binding to a quilt, the horizontal 1/4 inch line helps you know when you need to stop before pivoting. You will find additional uses during your quilting adventures. I mentioned keeping it in place earlier. Here is another example of when it will come in handy. There are times when working with angles that aligning the pieces while maintaining the 1/4 inch seam allowance is difficult. By simply laying the fabric pieces on the 1/4 inch seam guides, you can tell if you have the correct seam allowance. The next few slides are examples of advanced quilting techniques. Although I'm not going to explain in detail these techniques, just keep in mind that whenever you are directed to draw lines, you don't have to. Just use the clearly perfect angles. This first technique is using the basic B alignment. Instead of cutting it apart at this point, rotate the fabric and sew an additional 2 seams. When you cut it apart as shown here, you will end up with 8 half-square triangles, and you didn't draw a line. These next few slides illustrate a popular technique for making flying geese. Again, when you are instructed to draw a line, use perfect angles instead and save yourself time. This slide is showing how easy it is to chain piece with any of the techniques. It also illustrates a technique for making hourglass blocks. Thanks for taking the time to learn about the revised Clearly Perfect angles. There is more information and additional videos on my website. Please feel free to contact me with additional questions. This is Carrie Carr for New Leaf Stitches. Thank you.